This movie is about a decorated Marine of two wars. Sergeant Thomas Highway. On his last posting before retirement, he must train a group of undisciplined recruits. He must turn them into fighting machines. But first he must get out of jail. Sergeant Highway was arrested for urinating on a police car. He is telling war stories to his cellmates. A big ugly bully is annoyed with his storytelling. He approaches the sergeant aggressively. He tells him, "I don't like soldier boys." The bully challenges the sergeant. Sergeant Highway explains the damage he can cause. He tells the bully that he is mean, nasty, and very tired. And he can put a round through a flea from 200 meters away. "So you go get in somebody else's face before I push yours in." The bully responds, "You ain't gonna be so smart with your balls stuffed in your mouth." He kicks the bully and begins destroying him. He tells the bully to sit there before you feel some real pain. But the bully stands back up and pulls out a knife. He says, "I'm gonna carve me some jarhead meat." The sergeant easily disarms and destroys him. He sits back down with his cigar. Then he resumes telling his war stories. He is released from jail soon after the fight. He is called to see his commanding officer. He is told that his request has been approved. He will be transferred to a Fleet Marine Force unit. Sergeant Highway arrives to his new assignment. Major Powers is not impressed with his war record. He tells the sergeant that this is the new Marine Corps, and that his old ways of doing things are history. Marines like you should be retired from the Corps. The major looks at the sergeant's medals. He is not very impressed. "I asked them to send me a Marine and they send me a relic." He tells the sergeant what his assignment is. There is a recon platoon that lack discipline. "I want those men to be highly motivated." The sergeant responds, "I will make Marines out of them, sir." Major Powers tells him, "You're dismissed." Sergeant Highway arrives at the platoon's barracks. He asks two Marines if this is recon platoon. One responds, "No speak English." He enters the barracks and is not very impressed. There is loud music blasting. The men are kicking back and shooting pool. They all just ignore the sergeant's presence. The sergeant turns off the radio. A Marine turns it back on. The sergeant throws the radio across the room. The platoon takes notice. The sergeant introduces himself. "I'm here to change your life. I have been chosen to turn you into Marines." One Marine responds, "We can take care of ourselves." The sergeant replies, "You couldn't take care of a wet dream." Then he breaks the pool cue. A Marine tells the sergeant, "We already kick butt." The sergeant grabs him by the nose. He tells them that their last sergeant was a pussy. "Starting right now, you're going to start acting like Marines." Then Corporal Jones enters the room. The two mad dog each other. The sergeant walks over to him. He tells the platoon that they should go into town tonight. They should get all their partying out of the way. Because at 0600 tomorrow your ass is mine. He leads the corporal by his ear outside. Everyone follows them. They crossed over to their sleeping quarters. He tells them to clean the place up. Because tomorrow morning, your lives are changing. Before he leaves, he rips the corporal's earring off. After the sergeant is gone, they all talk about kicking his ass. The platoon comes up with a plan. When the Swede gets out of the brig, he'll take care of him. They cuss and beat their chest. The next morning, the sergeant surprises them. He wakes them up at 5 instead of 6 and they complain. The sergeant replies, "So I can't tell time now, get your asses up." They line up outside. They are not early birds. The sergeant tells them the Marines are looking for a few good men. But unfortunately, you're not them. He has them remove their t-shirts. One Marine is wearing shades. The sergeant walks over and smashes them. He checks out their hair. He tells them, "Tomorrow morning you all get Marine haircuts. When you start looking like Marines, you'll start feeling like Marines." Then he gives the order right face. He marches them away. The platoon is not very impressed. Sergeant Highway's platoon begins a marching cadence. A Model A Ford and a tank full of gas. A handful of pussy and a mouth full of ass. Major Powers and a female lieutenant are watching. Major Powers is disgusted, but the lieutenant cracks a smile. The platoon runs through the hills. Sergeant Highway starts pushing them harder. The platoon is starting to get into shape. He lets them get ahead of him. Then he opens fire on him. They are confused and run for cover. The sergeant tells them this is an AK-47 assault rifle. It is the weapon of your enemy. It makes a distinctive sound, so remember it. Then the run continues. They are back in their barracks. They are complaining about being pushed too hard. The sergeant walks in and tells them to fall out. The platoon tells him they ain't going nowhere. This war-playing game is bullshit. Corporal Jones tells him he's been voted out of office. The sergeant responds, "You fall out or I'm gonna kick your ass." The corporal tells him, "I don't think so, Sarge." Then he calls for his backup Swede. The platoon all start chanting "Swede, Swede, Swede." Then a very large and muscular Marine appears. Corporal Jones introduces him to Sergeant Highway.
The sergeant checks him out. The Swede tells the sergeant he will tear off his head and sit down his neck. The platoon tells the sergeant to hit the road jack. The Swede attacks the sergeant, but the sergeant makes short work of him. He looks at the platoon. He tells them to get their asses outside now. The Swede gets up and says, "I will wait outside for the police." The sergeant tells him, "Negative, get your ass outside. I'm going to make a marina out of you." Then the Marines are called into action. The island of Grenada was under siege. There were American students trapped there. They needed to be rescued. The U.S. feared they would be taken hostage. The Marines load their equipment onto the chopper. Then they leave the carrier. Soon they will be on the island of Grenada. They hear gunfire as they walk through the jungle. They run for cover. They are taking fire from the enemy across the road. They cover the sergeant as he runs across the road. The enemy retreats back into the woods. The Marines continue to advance. The sergeant is waiting for the retreating enemy. He opens fire and kills them all. He rolls one over and says they are Cubans. They were a three-man Rican team. There's probably more of them out here. He tells his platoon, "Let's move out." Then they approach a bridge. It is being guarded by a machine gun nest. They spot the Marines and opened up on them. They see a bulldozer sitting on the road. The sergeant asks Corporal Jones if he can operate it. Jones replies, "Yes, sir. I can handle it." Jones runs through the bulldozer while dodging bullets. The battle for the bridge rages on. Jones starts the bulldozer. He heads directly towards the machine gun nest. Bullets are ricocheting off the bulldozer. As it gets closer, the platoon falls in behind it. The enemy runs for their lives. The bulldozer demolishes the machine gun nest, but there is another machine gun nest on the other side. The Marines fight their way across the bridge. Then the enemy is destroyed and the bridge is open. Now they can go to the university and check on the Americans. The sergeant tells them to identify themselves when they enter a room. The Marines go from building to building. One Marine gets spooked and opens fire on a skeleton. Corporal Jones had a better experience. As he entered the room, a young lady was getting out of the shower. He smiled and said, "The U.S. Marines are here." The Marines finally locate the American students. The students are overjoyed at being rescued. They are all loaded onto a truck and taken to a safe place. Then Major Powell arrives. The sergeant tells him all the details about the operation. The major seems more concerned with taking pictures. He wants to take all the credit for the rescue. A radio call comes in from the general. He tells them to get off their ass and get back into the war. The general tells them that a flyboy spotted some armor. He said it's up on that hill over there. Major Powers orders the sergeant to go and investigate. He tells him to wait for Foxtrot Company before engaging. The platoon makes their way to the location. They come under fire from an armored vehicle. Along with Cuban troops, the platoon runs for shelter. They are under heavy fire. The platoon is trapped inside an old structure. They are taking casualties. The radio is damaged and communication is knocked out. They find a phone, but the line has been cut. Corporal Jones goes up on the roof to repair the connection. The phone is repaired. A Marine makes an emergency long-distance call. He calls Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. The operator wants a credit card number. Corporal Jones just happens to have one. The call goes through. The Marine gives the coordinates just as the phone goes out. No one is sure they received the message. Sergeant Highway takes a smoke bomb. He runs outside to set it off by the armored vehicle. He throws a smoke bomb next to it. But a shell explodes near him, and he falls through the ground. The Marines can see his body laying on the ground. The platoon charges outside to take out the enemy. The battle rages on and two gunships arrive. They fire and destroy the armored vehicle. The platoon runs over to check on the sergeant. Luckily, he was only knocked unconscious by the blast. He regains consciousness. He tells Corporal Jones, "Just because we're holding hands, that doesn't mean we're going steady." He gets back on his feet. The platoon moves out to finish the job. They approach an old fortress. They climb up the wall one by one. There are Cuban troops inside the old fortress. They begin firing at the Marines. The Marines toss some grenades into the structure. Then they open fire into the darkness. The Cuban troops surrender and come out. The sergeant is proud of his Marines. He sits down to enjoy a Cuban cigar. He gives the order to Corporal Jones. He tells him to move the prisoners out. The sergeant is relaxing and here comes Major Powers. He shouts at the sergeant, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The sergeant responds, Just enjoying the view, sir. The major tells him you disobeyed a direct order. You were not supposed to take this hill without me. Now get on your feet, Sergeant. Sergeant Highway tells him you're beginning to bore me, sir. Things are about to get ugly. Then the general's chopper arrives. They watch as it lands, and the general steps out. The major immediately accuses Sergeant Highway of disobeying a direct order. I told him to wait for support before they attacked this hill. The general asks the sergeant why. The sergeant replies, Marines are trained to improvise, sir. The lieutenant speaks up, I gave the order, sir. The general asks the major, are you new to the infantry? He replies, yes, sir, I came over from supplies. The general tells him you should stick to it, because you're a complete disaster as an infantry officer. This is a Marine amphibious unit, major. My men are hard targets, they work on personal initiative. The major is in shock. The general looks at him and says, you're dismissed. The general walks over to the sergeant. He tells him to go finish your job, Marine. Sergeant Highway responds, yes, sir. Then we are back in the States. The Marines are returning from Grenada. Their families are waiting for them. The Marines are glad to be back on American soil. Sergeant Highway sees the love of his life. They make eye contact. No words are needed. They walk away together, and so the movie ends. If you enjoyed watching this condensed version of Heartbreak Ridge, please click on the subscribe and like buttons, and leave a comment. And thanks for watching.